Hi, this is Dave McComb, Semantic Arts. It's January 2nd, 2020, and today's Gist Council is going to be about Mereology. Get the buttons to work. There we go. So somebody pointed out that we aren't terribly crisp, clear, and/or consistent on our use of partOf. So let's try and make some progress on clearing that up. I went through Gist 9.0 to look at everything that might be kind of a variation of partOf. Right off the top, there's, the direct partOf and partOf that's the place where we kind of get started. And just to remind anybody, we're going to get in deeper into this as we go later, but we followed the pattern that a lot of people have preceded us with by saying the direct partOf is how something is immediately part of something, and that the more general partOf is the transitive version. Spark plug is part of an engine is part of the car. So if you want to see a tree, you use partOf, direct partOf, and if you just want to see all the parts, it's transitive. So spark plugs are part of the car, but at that level, you can't. The tree has vanished. And each of those has an inverse. There's several others, though, that are worth talking about today. There's one called connected to. If you just think of that literally in English, you might think that, the chute is connected to the extruder, or, anything that's kind of assembled is connected to. But in the comment, we sort of suggest that not to use it that way. We use the term not non-owning, but the more I've looked at this one, I think this one's kind of a little bit on the dangerous side. So we'll come back to that. We've got some geo predicates that we talked about over the last several meetings. We've got their analog to partOf, which is geo directly contains. Oh, yeah, there was my Skype call. Sorry, supposed to be an hour ago. We've got the analog to the direct part, but then I noticed looking there, I think when we get to the end of this call, we're going to talk about this. We've got a geo occupies and a permanent occupies that may be a bit redundant. We've got members and member of for collections. We've got ordered members and ordered members of. We have subtasks and direct subtasks. We have made up of, which we'll get to in a minute. And we've got a super category, which, it's a bit of a stretch to think of that, but bear with me here. So here's what we're going to try and cover today. Do we have enough distinctions? Do we have too many? And is there anything that we need to kind of clean up or crisp up either on the formal side or the informal side? So people have written a lot on this topic. I had this book called Parts, which I couldn't find, so I bought another copy. Michael wrote a paper about this as far back as 1995. In fact, people have been writing about this for thousands of years, at least hundreds of years, pretty seriously. Interestingly, I found the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy had some very interesting stuff in it, and when I eventually went to FIBO and started tracing down how they thought about partOf, they bottomed out in this exact same URL here, so that was sort of interesting. And I've had this giant pile of papers on semantics and ontologies and stuff, and I was pretty convinced that I had several papers in there, but I spent a day over the holiday, went through that whole archive. I couldn't find it, but anyway. And I don't know if you've ever searched this on the internet. The stuff you come up with isn't terribly helpful, but I'll try and be a guide here for that. So here's a page from the 350-page book called Parts. These kind of books, I say, it's almost like you open it up and you think, oh, maybe they got the wrong font. Maybe they have Zaf Dingbats instead of Times Roman or something, because here's a whole page of E's and A's and backward E's and all that stuff. Um, what is going on in this book? Mostly philosophers arguing with each other and and a lot of mathematical proof. What if you take these handful of lemmas? What can you derive from it? So it seemed like they were way more interested in the what can you derive mathematically given which assumptions you make. But every once in a while they'd come up with something interesting. And then the highlights, at least as far as I was concerned, what interesting they came up with. They made an interesting distinction between occurrence, or things that happened like events, and continuance, stuff and people and cars and all that kind of stuff. And the difference is that with occurrence, you don't have, well, weirdly, it sounds funny when I say this, but you don't have to worry about time, because you while your bicycle, you can swap out the derailleur, and so last week it had a Shimano, and next week it'll have a whatever the newest one is, Campanello or something. But events can't be like that. You can't say last week World War II had a Battle of the Bulge, and this week we swapped that one out, and it now doesn't have it. No, I mean, things just happened, and so it's in a way it's simpler. So that was kind of an interesting observation. He spent, of course, any good philosopher would spend a lot of time with the ship of Theseus problem. And for those who are new to that one, Theseus had this boat, and he sailed around the Mediterranean and was constantly, replacing the sails and the mast and every plank on the side of the boat and the deck and everything else. And by the time he got back, there was no original parts, but it was still the same ship. So that's this giant conundrum that philosophers argue about a lot. This guy went one step further and said, what if somebody was coming around behind him and picking up all the parts that he had disposed and put them back together? Then which would be the real ship of Theseus? Now, in the first place, he failed to notice that all the parts that Theseus discarded were crap, and if you put it all together, it probably wouldn't be seaworthy. But he spent a lot of time saying that the one that he was sailing around maintained the form or the function of the ship, and the other one was materially consistent. So you could have two versions if you used to. Anyway. And he also dealt a lot, as did Michael in his paper, as to whether subsets are a part of their superset. We're going to get into that. But this is a pretty dense book. I read about half of it, and I didn't do any of the proofs. Then I went out to just find a few ontologies that use partOf and see what they had to say about it. Turns out there is an ontology that's literally called partOf, and it just has a handful of properties and a few annotations. Nothing terribly surprising in there. BFO, the basic foundational ontology, has something they call fiat part. They are mostly looking, or at least this part of it is looking at human anatomy, and the fiat idea, which I think is kind of an interesting one, is suggesting that in the general case, thoraxes have lungs and lungs have hearts and all that kind of stuff. But when you're actually dealing with a specific human, you don't care about hardly any of that, just the part you changed or the part you replaced or whatever. Fibo has something called is partOf. And if you follow in their annotation, they went right back to Stanford Mereology, and they went with what we're going to have in a slide or two from now, the concept of a proper part, which I think is a sensible way to go. The only other thing I found that had partOf in it was country is partOf, or state is part of country, or something like that. And then they declared it to be equivalent, which seemed odd. In fact, I should go study that. If there's any domains and ranges on, something as part of a country, then all of a sudden we're going to find that cars are countries and all that kind of crazy stuff. But that was about as far as I went with that. So you have to take a position when you read through all that stuff. Here's what, and I did do some searching on the internet and stuff. This is sort of the majority opinion. That part of should be reflexive, meaning that everything is part of itself. Any part of a thing is itself. Any part of a thing is part of that thing. That's transitivity, and that no two distinct things can be part of each other. So we're gonna unpack each of these a little bit. This is where there's really two schools of thought. Either you say things are part of themselves. You either say that a car is part of a car, or they're not. Second bullet there is things are not part of themselves. So if you take that second position, you say that a part is a proper part. It means that it isn't itself. And if I parse this correctly, it seems like the mathematicians prefer the former definition. It seems like you can make more mathematical proofs from it. And naive realists prefer the latter idea, that things are not part of themselves. And my suggestion is, if we're going to explain this to people, I'd far rather try to explain. I don't want to explain why a book is part of a book, or an organization is part of an organization, or it's part of itself, and all that kind of stuff. That the proper part idea seems to be more intuitive and easier to communicate, and I don't think we're really going to give up anything there. But I don't know if anybody else has any strong opinion on that.
I would only observe that the proper part distinction, I think, is just the same as the set and proper set distinction.
Absolutely.
Which mathematicians find useful. So I think when one is talking of mathematical sets, we should continue to use what mathematicians have developed, which is the distinction between a set and a proper subset. But with physical composition, I think I agree with you. That's not a valuable thing to be able to say, that a car is part of itself. There's no value in doing that.
Yep, I agree.
But I'll just comment. I think an underlying issue I'm seeing already is the distinction between how things are parts physically and how things are parts conceptually. I think they're really fundamentally different.
Yeah, absolutely. We're going to get to that. Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
Cool.
Okay. Transitivity is I think everybody goes along with this. If A is part of B and B is part of C, then A is part of C. Although there was, in this book, there was all kinds of, and on the internet, all kinds of counter examples. The most, obvious one here: my fingers are part of me, and I am part of a team. Yet my fingers are not part of the team. Most people say, yeah, that seems right. But if you look at it, it's really, we're using one sense of the word part of in the first half of that sentence and a different sense in the second half, and then trying to infer over both of them and getting confused. In other words, my fingers are constitutively part of me, and I am part of membership, more like membership between me and the team than being physically constituted, if that's a word.
It's not as if one has to leave one's fingers on the bench when one goes in, the field.
True, and in fact, most of the rest of the examples were kind of like that. They say the handle is part of the door, and the door is part of the house, and all this, and they say the handle isn't part of the house. But you go, well, yeah, actually, it is. It's not convenient to say that, but try selling your house without the door handles. People are pissed off.
Yeah. Similar to what Ted just said, there's a difference between the conceptual use of all this versus I'll turn this around into how you'd use an inferencing engine. And so it going off of just this first bullet of transitivity, if you're going to try to infer things, then you almost need like I'm not sure what the word is, it's a root hole, so that when you transfer from the finger as a part of the person, but then a person as a part of the team, that you need something to be able to tell the engine, don't follow this.
Right. And I think if you said the fingers are part of the person and the person is a member of the team, the engine's not confused.
Yes.
Right, as long as you don't have a common super property, which you wouldn't want to have.
Right, exactly.
Or the common super property wouldn't be transitive.
Yeah, that's we got to look at that. Yep, exactly.
One thing, Dave, that I often use as a distinction here when this transitivity does work is if it's a physical part of.
Yeah.
And with house example is a good one.
Yep.
A lot of the other part of stuff is non-physical. It's how you think about things.
Yeah, and in fact, we're going to get to that. So here we go. So right now, relative to transitivity, I think I'm going to recommend, we're going to get deeper though, direct part of is the it is a direct proper part, which is non-transitive, and its super property, just part of, is the implied transitive. Most of the cases where we use that, the transitivity really does work. But we're going to keep going now. So this is interesting. First, this sounds sensible. If A and B are different, then A cannot be a proper part of B, while B is a proper part of A. Yeah, it sounds sensible. Then I said, what if we said that ontology A imports ontology B? I think I would say that B is then a proper part of A. If I import...
there's a problem there.
Yeah,
because importing means additive.
Yeah, it is kind of interesting, isn't it? And here, the second bullet is sort of where Ted was suggesting, where we begin to get in trouble. We our knowledge of the world and our instinctual belief about what a part of means comes from physicality. And then we try to apply that by analogy to things that aren't physical. And you get into things like this.
The ontology is interesting because, strictly speaking, an ontology is a collection. It's membership. An axiom is a member, if you like, of a collection of axioms, which is the ontology.
Yeah, but nobody talks that way.
They don't, but it's more or less true.
Yeah, it's true. When I always say ontology is a bag of triples or axioms.
Yeah, exactly.
Anyway, I'm going to leave that one just hang there for a minute because we got some. Let's go along with this anti-Semitic anti-symmetric stuff, and just say the parts can't be part of each other for now, because we're gonna tease this apart when we separate the physical from the not physical.
Yeah, Dave, I'm a little bit confused. A few minutes ago, and I think I broadly agreed, as did most everyone else, that you're not going to worry about this proper part distinction. Oh no, you are going to worry about it. You're just not going to allow the non-proper part to exist. Okay,
right. But now, later in the presentation, I'm going to get into different, subdomains or different types, and we're going to kind of revisit some of these things and say if they still apply. So here's some more of the topics that seem to come up when I look at this stuff. There's a lot of literature that suggested that subsets are part of sets, although a lot of the examples weren't very good. Like in the book, he was suggesting that Belgium is part of Benelux. You go, yeah, maybe, but is it because it's geographically, contained, or is it membership, or what anyhow, we're gonna come back to whether a subset is a part of a bigger set. What we started talking about last time we were talking was using cascading delete as sort of the litmus test. But it's interesting how few things you can even delete. So we're going to get into that in a minute, because if delete doesn't make any sense, then cascading delete as the test doesn't make any sense. We're going to get into whether you can share parts, and whether parts have independent existence, and whether you should primarily be talking about the part being part of the whole or the whole having parts. And finally, we're going to get into temporality and partness. So we got a lot of material to cover. Here we go. Is a set of trees part of a given forest? And if you think that, I think we're thinking of sets and collections there. Is a lion part of a pride? Yeah, probably. Is a player part of a team? This one gets really weird. Is an employee part of the set of all employees? Or, is it part of this? Are people who work for semantic arts part of the set of semantic arts employees, which we think of as being a class? But, if you think like Psych does, you'd say, yeah, it's a class, but in fact, Psych comes right out and says that all the instances of the class are members of that class. So they both treat it like a type and at the same time like a collection.
Yeah, that is interesting, Dave. When I think of sets, I think of set membership. Actually, I don't think of part of.
Yeah.
That's a linguistic thing.
Yeah, and in fact, the further you go down this path, to me, the worse it looks. Because...
And OWL.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
And OWL, the semantics of the class is exactly a mathematical set. So what Psych comes out and calls a member is fine. And RDF type is the name of the link, but the meaning is still a mathematical set in OWL. That's right. The formal semantic set.
Right. Now, I think the slippery slope is when we start calling it a part, because now all of a sudden, we would literally be saying that RDF type is a subproperty of just direct part of.
Right. But also too, there's in the way you have phrased some of these bullets, there's a little bit of mixture going on, because the first bullet you said a certain set of trees, which to me implied that there was some sort of identifier that you would of that set, and so one could say that the set had an independent, identity apart from the forest. If you cut down all the rest of the forest except for that set, there's some existence there. Whereas most of the other things, it did sound like it was talking about membership in, individual instance membership in a set. So I think the first bullet part of might apply, and others less so.
I think what's going on here, and maybe you're going to summarize by saying this, Dave, later, but what's really going on here, as far as I can tell, is the question here seems to be one of, in English, in your mind, intuitively, when people say, is a lion part of a pride, does that seem reasonable to you? So you can say yes or no, but we're saying yes for a lot of these cases precisely because that's part of our common usage, but it's the ambiguity of the common usage that causes the problem.
Exactly.
Yeah, I totally agree. I think, in fact, that's 80% of the issue. That part of action has many meanings, and our job as ontologists is to separate out those meanings, and we might conclude at the end that we don't even want to say part of, or that if we do, we mean it in just a particular sense.
Exactly. I understood that as the whole problem we were trying to solve here, the ambiguity of the natural language term.
Yep, exactly. So for right now, my bottom bullet here is let's not use the term part of when we're talking about sets and subsets and membership and types and all that.
Yep.
I agree. That makes a lot of sense.
Yep.
It's confusing.
Yep.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Good. Okay. We'll keep going then. You know, Mark Wallace brought up delete as being the test for whether something really is a part or not. And it seems, you know, if you've been a software developer, it seems like such a great test because, you know, when you assemble stuff, you know, in object-oriented trees or nests or whatever, and you delete the top thing, you know, everything that did not have independent existence gets blown away with it. But as we started thinking about it, delete shows up a lot in software and documents, but not for a lot of the things that we talk about as having parts. So we're gonna take a little diversion here and look at the universe of things that might have parts. So here is my main universe. I'm going to start with physically identifiable items, you know, things that have independent existence, and we could, you know, conceivably at least put an identifier on it, like a specific car, a specific computer, or a building, or even a living thing. Living things can have parts. They can have lungs and hearts and stuff like that. So that's one kind of thing that can have parts. It's quite a different, you know, substances, things that do not have independent individual identity, but you know, we can measure and we can talk about. You know, Head and Shoulders shampoo is a substance. It's made up of stuff. It has parts, if you will. Or your birthday cake, you know, we either put some eggs in it or we didn't, or we put some flour and it either has gluten or it doesn't have gluten, and the people who are gluten sensitive are going to care about that. We have events that have parts. You know, World War II had a Battle of the Bulge and a D-Day and a this and a that and all that kind of stuff. Those were parts of the event, the bigger, longer term event. Or you can have your root canal had a numbing part and a drilling part and a whatever they do with when you have a root canal. Or, you know, I went into the jury thing last week. It says next week when I was writing this. It was a couple weeks ago. So they have a part where they educate you, and then they have a part where they randomly select you, and then there's a part where they do voir dire, and I got out of it. So yeah, that's how parts are in events. We could talk about parts in processes. So my distinction here between events and processes, events, things that actually either are very specific, you know, that particular project or you know, my particular jury summons, whereas a process is almost the template or the more abstract how you would hope things go. So, you know, I have a process for running payroll that I do every month, and every month I have to change it a little bit. Or I have a process for making coffee that involves grinding beans and pouring water and all that. So those are part of. Any kind of a digital document, whether it's content programs, contracts, you know, it's easy to think of the you know, this particular term or article or paragraph being part of this contract. We got geospatial areas, which we've talked about a lot. We'll come back to them in a minute. We've got organizations where we say, you know, the HR department is, or maybe legal and compliance. Legal is part of legal and compliance. Legal and compliance is part of something else. We also sometimes talk about metadata. You know, we can talk about tables being part of a database or columns being part of a table or things like that. Recipes and bills of material, a little bit like processes, but I wanted to call them out a little separately here. You know, if you have a recipe, the ingredients are part of the recipe, and the flour is part of the ingredients, and all that kind of stuff. And if you haven't yet, you know, if you've built a rocket, the fuel tanks very specifically are part of that rocket. But when you have a bill of materials for building future rockets, you can still say the intention to put fuel tanks on is part of the intention to build the rocket. And very similar to that.
There's one more.
Yeah.
Dave, do you have more coming on the next slide?
No. What did I miss?
Yeah, I looked up part of in Dolce, and they say very sensibly, January 2020 is part of the year 2020. So time intervals have subtime intervals.
Okay.
I had a quick question, particularly around your distinction between events and processes.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't know if this fits or not, but I want to bring it up. And that is that events have event triggers. So there's some triggering portion that has no duration.
Oh.
But it doesn't start without that triggering event happening, right? World War II, the Treaty at Versailles, or whatever you come up with for the various things. The root canal is because you had pain, etc. That there's a causal thing. And is that a part of the event or not?
Yeah, I think it is. I've got a slide a little bit later as to saying how does the part become part of the whole? And in fact, it's interesting with the root canal. When do you think that actually started? And very often it's after the fact that you figure out when it started.
Here's another thing about events. If you have an event that's like a concert or a sporting event, you could view the ticket sales. This is where we use what we call meronymic associations in REA. It's to account for that type of association between the concert tickets and the concert itself. Because, for example, you get the cash receipt from selling the ticket, and if the concert doesn't happen, then you have to give a refund to the customers typically. But if they just don't use their ticket, if they don't come, you don't give them a refund.
Yeah, no, that's a good one. Yeah. Yeah, I think in gist, we probably literally say that the obligations are part of the agreement, and there's two obligations. One obligation is the obligation to pay, and the other is the obligation to deliver, and in this case, deliver a sporting event. But I think that is part of, even in, yeah. Yep.
What about conceptual things or intellectual things like a story, not as it's written in a particular document, but just the abstract story itself? And are the characters part of the story? The events that occur in the story are part of the story?
Yeah, that's a good one.
There's another one that I'm just thinking of, and you mentioned it earlier, super category. So if you look at a subject matter, quantum physics, that's a concept, but the topic of quantum entanglement is a subtopic of that. So it's part of that field, if you like, part of that field of research.
Yeah.
Right.
My observation from all of this is that I don't think we can ontologically close the set of relationships which are described using the English phrase part of. I think we can identify some useful ones,
right?
But I doubt that we could ever say we've covered all part of relationships that we can dream of. And I'm not sure it'd be useful to do that anyway.
Right. I think the useful thing for doing this is I think we're going to treat some of these differently.
Right.
Yeah. This is like a list of requirements. We have to know how to do each one of these things. Is it or isn't it part? Is it or isn't it member?
Yeah. But yeah, those are some good additions. And then I thought, let's look at what behaviors might apply to a whole, and therefore would it apply to the parts or not? And the original one we started with was deletion. If you delete the whole, do you not delete the parts? But there's about 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 or however many there I've got here that that apply differently to different of those little subdomains. Like you don't delete a human. You can kill them, but you don't literally delete them. That's a very software-y way of looking at a human. But some of the other things that are interesting, even without destroying things, if you transfer them, do the parts go along? If you move something, do the parts go along? If you clone it, do the parts come along? If you have a template and you instantiate something, do the parts go somewhere? And then we start getting into, when just the act of thinking about separating parts from wholes, what does that imply? And actually, Ted had some notes in his slides about containment that I want to touch on. I don't even remember what I was thinking about with conversion, but we'll get to that. So these things are behaviors. These are not meant to be properties. These are meant to be, like delete is not a triple. It's not a property. You don't attach A, delete B. You decide you're going to delete A, and now you got to figure out what happened to B. So,
hey, just comment. So yes, in English, we would never say we're deleting a human, but if you look at the broader semantic meaning, cause to cease to exist, then destruction, death, deletion, they pretty much mean the same thing.
Is that true? Where did you get that broad? Did you just go look it up?
No, I'm just saying, if you delete something, it no longer exists. If you kill a person, that person no longer exists. The body does. I'm just saying.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it's the difference is when you delete something, you're not ending a process. When a person dies, their life process ends, but their body continues to exist. And even if you, quote unquote, destroy the body, you're not destroying the matter, you're destroying its integrity. So I don't think they're analogous at all.
Do we really want to get into the whole religious issue, though, of whether this?
No, we don't.
So therefore, I don't think it's useful to talk about deletion, death as a deletion.
Yeah, I agree.
I mean, I agree with Dave that deletion is very limited, really.
Yep. In fact, we're going to see how limited it is right here in this little matrix I just built. So of all those types of things I had on the 2 slides ago, deletion really only applies to digital documents and metadata, and maybe to recipes and bills of material, because in a way they are kind of digital documents. Death and destruction apply to certain physical things. We talked about if you destroyed France, you destroy Paris, but you can't destroy France. You can't delete it. You can't kill it. You can't. I mean, that. You can cover it up with an ice age or something, but it's still there. If you changing ownership applies to some of these things. Moving, I'm not sure why I thought an event could be moved. I got to think about that one for a minute.
Temporally. Oh, you can move the venue.
Huh?
You can move the venue. We were going to hold it in Sydney, but now we're going to hold it in Auckland.
Oh, yeah. There you go. Yeah, for a planned event. Obviously, you can't move an event that's already happened.
Yeah.
I think transfer of ownership applies to organizations as well, right?
Yep. In fact, I'm going to take myself out of presentation mode so I can edit this while you guys are talking. Yep. And I'll put planned event here to remind myself.
You can move an occurring event. For example, if you're at a wedding and it starts to rain, you move from the patio to the inside.
Yep. So a contemporaneous event, but not a historical. If once the wedding's over, you can't change the venue.
But changing the venue is not really moving from inside to outside. Is moving, not deleting, not destroying one event and starting another one.
I would also ask whether the venue is actually part of the event.
The what is part of the event?
Well, just because you move inside to outside doesn't actually change the part-whole relationship, does it?
So what are you wondering whether it's the part of the event?
Well, Matt, I think that's a good point, and maybe the point is the venue is not part of the event; it is the location of the event.
Yes.
You're changing the location of the event. Yes.
Okay.
But movement is change of location. So it sort of questions what is movement.
Okay.
If you change the date of a planned event, Was that what you were thinking about in terms of movement? Because again, in the loose, common, natural language, we say I'm moving. I'm moving the meeting to Thursday.
I would put a question mark on that events bucket because it's
a little bit. That wasn't what I intended, but yeah.
Okay.
That. I like the discussion about locate. So most events have a location, but but rather than saying the location is part of the event, if we just say that it's the location of the event, then we won't get mixed up.
Just a parenthetical comment. If I go to a kayak seminar that's held on the water and it starts lightning, you go off the water, but you continue the seminar. You just do different things.
Right.
Yeah, exactly.
The question is the water part of the event, or is that just where it was located?
I think it's or
if you have a coordinated event.
Without the water, you can't do the things that you were going to do as part of the event. And the event intrinsically changes to something else. I can't practice rolling a kayak on land.
Well, I'd like to watch you try.
Yeah.
But yeah. But yeah, I'm not certain. We could spend a lot of time on this, but also you could have an event with multiple locations.
For first night.
So simultaneous locations. So some big protest event that is a coordinated protest event occurring in Washington D.C. and Los Angeles at the same time. Are they you could say each of those separate events was part of a larger event, but that doesn't necessarily deal with the movement question.
And then there's this event, this Just Council Talk Day, right, which doesn't really have it has a cyber location. If you think of the GoToMeeting link as a cyber location, which you might reasonably do.
I don't know. Do many of you guys have a hard stop at the top of the hour?
I don't.
I'm going to press on.
I don't.
Yeah, some of you guys may, but
I will have to drop.
Yeah, you can sort of see where I'm going here with this thought process. And then I went one step further, and I said, okay, if on the left, I've subsetted it a little bit here, but if I get physical items, substances, networks, which I'd forgotten in the previous one, which I'll come back to, geospatial digital event collections and concepts. So I brought collections and concepts back in here. I wanted to look at what causes the whole to even come into being. Because we talk about parts and wholes, but like with cars and stuff, the whole comes into existence in the process of assembly. So the parts come together to make a whole. In fact, most manufactured things are that way. Most additive manufactured things are that way. Whereas living things, it's the other way around. The whole comes into existence at birth.
The stations.
But when we deal with substances, where did the whole come from? Well, the crude oil came from extraction. We took it out of the ground, and now all of a sudden we say we have 1,000 gallons of Brent crude or whatever the hell we have. And we are going to think about the fact that there is stuff in that is part of that, if you will. It's made up of some other combination of chemicals that we might want to get out of there. Whereas in other cases, the substance came into being by combination of other substances.
Hey, Dave, I was going to say, at first I was just saying to me, I thought it was clear that the whole there's some event that causes the whole. But that's not always true because, there's the assembly of the car. That's one example. But then there's also the slicing of the loaf of bread. right? Once you've sliced it, your parts are the pieces of bread. But one of them is additive in the sense that you're assembling the car. The other one is it's almost destructive. That you bake there's a baking event causes the loaf of bread to be there, and then there's a slicing event that actually causes the parts. But the parts don't exist until that slicing event happens. So I still might argue, still might argue there's some event that causes the part-whole relationship to exist.
Yep. It's funny, the more you think about it, it is kind of a funny thing. And the further you get down this list, it gets weirder. Geospatial regions, where did they come from? Well, somebody just declared them. You just show up, some poor people living in the Amazon didn't realize that was the Amazon or it was Brazil or whatever it was. And people just show up and say, oh, yeah, by the way, Treaty de Tordesillas says that this is Portuguese territory now. And we just make it up, right? And now you have this whole country called Brazil that you have to start carving into little parts.
Well, I think it's important to distinguish the geopolitical, or the political. France is a political entity from France is a geographical entity.
Yep.
Because different things will go along with the destruction of one versus the destruction of the other.
Yeah. The government of France is an organization, and whatever it makes, and once it declares itself into existence, it can make up its own parts, its own agencies and departments and all that stuff. But at some point it said, this part of the earth, I'm going to call it France, or, Alsace, if you will. I call this little spot Alsace, and we run it for now, but every time the Germans come in here, they think they're going to run it, and, But the fact that we call the Alsace a region that's identifiable, even though we argue about who owns it right now, somewhere we drew a thing on a map and said, oh yeah, that's 10,000 square miles.
But there are other kinds of georegions that could be said to naturally occur, like a river or a mountain. Those exist without somebody declaring that they exist.
That's true.
Yeah.
So that's the point you made a moment ago, Rebecca. It's geopolitical ones that are declared. Maybe that's what Dave was thinking.
Well, there are different. I think there's more than one. So there's my neighborhood that exists because I declare it, or someone has declared it. It's not a geopolitical region. It's just my neighborhood. There's a geopolitical region like a country, and then or the EU, and then there's a river or a mountain or a lake, which has an existence without any humans declaring it to have an existence.
That one being the physical region. But, again, we're tight on time, so I guess we move on. But I would note the thing about the slicing of the bread, it would go under the column of behavior that affects parts because that alters or transforms the loaf. So there's an additional behavior there for physical items.
Yep. Okay, I don't have a huge more, but one question. So we started this by saying deletion was the litmus test as to whether a part fit our definition of a part. If you deleted the parent, you delete everything else. We'll leave this for a homework assignment. Is there anything that covers most or all of these things that we would say, I think we think if you transfer the ownership of a whole, that the parts should go along with it. And at least for physical things, if you move it, stuff like that. Anyhow, think on that one. Can parts be shared? And for physical things, I think it's true that things can only directly be part of one whole. So my heart can only be directly part of my chest or directly part of me. Now that question, in fact, that came up in the geospatial. It's a subjective decision as to which directly you pick. Once I say my heart is directly part of me, and then later I say, oh, my chest is part of me, and now I have to rearrange things, and my heart's part of my chest. Now, I forgot about my chest earlier. But at some point, it can't be directly part of two things.
What about Siamese twins? Or a wall shared by two apartments.
Oh yeah, the wall one's good. That did come up some.
Oh,
that's a good one.
Well, and Dave,
yeah.
Earlier in this talk, you also, sorry to interrupt you, but you had mentioned something about temporality, and it seems like that your heart can't be a part of more than one person at the same time. You could transfer your heart to somebody else.
But let's talk about the shared wall one. Is a good one.
Yeah, that is a good one. Is the wall the part of the room that divides the room?
Or even, if you're in a townhouse and there's a wall between you and your neighbor, is it part of your property, part of theirs, or?
Yeah, that's a good one. There's probably, I bet you there's legal things about the business about directly, Dave. I think you've tagged the fact that it's a little bit problematic. It's arbitrary. You could change the granularity. But I think there was something we're trying to tag here, and I'm not sure the best words to characterize it. But just take example of a bolt on an airplane or a rivet. Right? It's part of maybe 6 or 8 or 10 levels of stuff. But a bolt on an airplane can't be a bolt on 2 different ideas.
Right.
I think that's what you're trying to get.
Yeah. Also that the idea of, okay, if that rivet is part of the airplane, if the airplane moves, hopefully the rivet goes with it.
Right. Yep. But anyhow, I wanted to.
So on the final bullet here though about digital things don't have this non-sharedness, that also can apply to not just digital but also conceptual things like organizations. I can belong to 2 organizations simultaneously.
Yes.
Yeah, no, that's a good one. Well, yeah. Let's talk about membership. Yeah, membership.
Oh, that's membership. Ah, yes, that's right. Membership, different. That's different.
Yep. Yeah.
Okay.
That's good.
So when you talk about digital things, so I think you're maybe mixing 2 different things, conceptual things and digital things. So a paragraph in a digital object is really a collection of bits, which can only belong to that digital object. But it's the
content.
The content can be in multiple documents. Yes.
Right. Yep.
So that's not really just digital things. That's content in general.
Yeah. Yeah.
And there's also a sense that you can't destroy content. You could say I destroyed every single copy of, Hamlet, but if somebody memorized it word for word, all they have to do is write it down again. You didn't actually destroy it.
Yeah.
You can delete it.
Yep. Actually,
yeah, you could, but then
that came up here. That's coming up.
Yeah, okay.
I'm gonna delete the person who memorized Hamlet.
Oh, that's funny.
So there's this whole question. In fact, this is where Matt was a while ago. There's identity, or potentially identity, to both the whole and parts. Obviously a computer can have a serial number. It may have parts that have serial numbers, but it may have a whole lot of things that are not individually identifiable. It used to be you could swap out a disk drive and put in another one. But you can't swap out the saw. Well, I don't know what you can do, but so a lot of times when you put something into a whole, it loses independent existence, especially with substances. When you put the butter in the cake, butter doesn't exist anymore.
That's the definition of substance, more or less.
Pretty much, yeah. But any kind of assembly has some of that. some things go in and lose their identity, and some things go in and can potentially maintain their identity.
Like even a hole.
It seems like there's this different context that you cross over. That I'm having car work done right now, and so to somebody, all of the pieces, they all have different, there are probably different part identifier numbers, but by the time it gets to the mechanic, he's just reaching for a cable, and that cable no longer has, in practical sense, there's no unique identity to this particular cable he's putting in.
Right.
To the cable manufacturer, that might be, cable 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But by the time it leaves the cable manufacturer, it's, it's just a cable.
Yep.
It's anonymous.
Okay, I think I only have 1 or 2 more slides. Yeah, I got 2, 3. And Kurt Cagle was into this when he did that project with us. Is there a correct? Should the subpart declare it to be a direct part of a whole, or should you do it the other way around? And I realize with inference, you can have it both ways, but really, a lot of times we do these things and we don't have inference and we expect it to be a particular way. And which way should we expect it? And I think in almost all the examples Kurt came across, it's far more natural to assert that the part is part of the whole. And I think that's true based on how these things come into existence and how they change over time. That we do in most things that we assemble or think of as having parts, we add the parts to the whole. The exception, though,
I think that's very context driven, because sometimes it makes, it would just kind of depend on, your particular business, what it is you are trying to manage or track.
I agree.
Yeah, well, I think, in fact, the last bullet there is kind of gives you a hint as to, for instance, if you're refining, the crude oil has this part gasoline. We didn't put the gasoline in the crude oil. So it'd be weird to think of it that way. Whereas when you're baking a cake, you do put the butter in the cake mix. You're not.
This comes up a lot when I'm just recently thinking of Morgan Stanley work. Here's 2 things, and there's a relationship between them that's very clear. Which one should we use?
Yep.
And I asked the question from a pragmatic perspective. When you're querying this data store, are you going to mostly be thinking from the perspective of the whole? What are my parts? Or are you mostly going to be thinking from the perspective of the parts and asking the question, what is my whole? And what I have found over the years is very often it's kind of clear. One is like, oh yeah, one feels more natural or it feels more likely to be going on. Sometimes it's not clear, but that's a question I ask myself.
Michael, there's the difference between the word composes versus comprises, and I will admit I get mixed up all the time. Well, no, look it up, Merriam-Webster dictionary. Not that it's God necessarily, but one of the dictionary, it makes a distinction between one is from the point of view of the whole, and one of them is from the point of view of the parts. So the whole comprises the parts, and the parts compose the whole. At least that's the dictionary definition between the two.
Yeah, that's right. People use the word comprise ambiguously. They don't get it right. I looked it up, and it's common usage.
And could we go back to the earlier slide? I'd like to finally say something. It seems to me that the direct part is such a generic word that it would be good to have a rich collection of terms within GIST that express this, that are specific to contexts and that are easy to use and normative for many people and many organizations, and that we make part has direct, the part direct part to be applied in specific areas where we don't have a more specific, more intuitive one. That can help us trying to boil the ocean with one term.
Yep, no, I agree. That's my last slide, so nice introduction.
Okay.
Jonathan, I got two to go here. The temporality one, this is the ship of Theseus and all that stuff, is a whole defined by its parts. Generally not. The definition of whether something's rigid is if you change any of its parts, would it be a different thing? And I think most physical things have some identity function. Like Tabby, has her life and all that kind of stuff, and you can take parts off, and it's still Tabby the cat. Anyway, let's move on to the thrilling conclusion here. That I think we're in pretty good shape with physically identifiable items. Specific, it should be a car or a human or whatever, that we could say something is a direct part of, and we mostly go from part to whole. And that substances, we have just made up of. I think we should rely on that more often and use that for substances. It's weird to talk about, butter being part of, or the cake having
I think
part.
I've never used is made up of. The reason I never use is made up of is we never have instances of substances. Because the substance is the physical stuff, and we never have instances of some portion of physical stuff. We might talk about 3 ounces of gold or aluminum, but we never talk about 3 specific ounces of gold. The only time you do that is if it's being shipped from A to B.
If it's a batch, I worked at a paper mill, and we had batches that were the source for individual rolls of paper.
Right, but the is made up of relationships would all be derived immediately from the specification, assuming that the batch was made according to spec. So you still wouldn't generally need to have those made up of relationships.
True. It is good to have in the ontology, though, to call out that this is for substance.
Yeah, I'm just making
Michael, would it matter?
Use this. Go ahead.
Hey, Michael, would it matter if, like in my business, I actually have to track lot numbers of what goes into things for traceability?
Well, lot numbers. Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. You could have to. There you might want to, but I just haven't run into it yet.
Pharmaceuticals do that a lot.
Yep.
Yeah, but I think the thing with the distinction here with the substances is if something loses its individual identity when it becomes part of the whole, or is joined to the whole, or however, that would be an appropriate point to use that property.
Right.
I think the lot is a good one, because you might have had one lot that had 3% of level of acidity instead of another lot which is 4 when it was supposed to be 3.5 in the beginning. So then the actual versus the specified, the actual would be where you use made up of.
Yep. I didn't talk a lot because I thought this only occurred to me late when I was putting the presentation together, and also networks and systems have only come into just relatively recently, but we have a way of referring to a network, whether it's a pipeline network or an Internet of Things network or whatever it is, as connecting nodes together, but we didn't do anything about subnetworks, and almost always are. Networks are composed of subnetworks, things like that we should probably add, and we shouldn't use part of, because we've got this incumbency relationship between the network and the actual equipment that's in that position in the network at this point in time. So I think we're missing something there.
But well, you don't think if we're saying, you know, node A, quite apart from whatever equipment instantiates node A, it's not proper to say node A is part of the network?
It might be.
That's analogous to our taxonomies. We say a concept is part of, or a member of a taxonomy, maybe not a part. Oh yeah, a member of the network. That's interesting. A member of a part.
That's interesting. It might be.
The network of collection of nodes.
Yeah, but it's possible. It is possible, I think, or the distinction maybe is that you could have there are some things you can think of that have no members, a set with no members, where the members have not been identified later or whatever. But a network with no nodes is not a network.
That's good. Yeah.
Or it's a null network. That gets back to the same question, more or less, of do we want things to be parts of themselves? That's a useful thing.
Well, I think what Dan just identified is a specification, that if there's a network that has no nodes, it's just a specification for what a network would be if it were instantiated, but it's not right now.
How about networks of people? You know, you could start a new network and nobody has yet joined it. There are no nodes, but there's still a network.
Yeah, I agree with that.
That's an empty set. Yeah, that's just a choice.
So I think one of the open questions here is, should we use part of or something else for the relationship of hierarchies, I guess, in a network or a system?
Well, there's two things going on here. I think when you're talking about the to node and from node, then we're a little bit into the behavior. Whereas, you know, just identifying nodes as part of network without knowing, is it to or a from node or both? I still think part of could be applied properly to a network. I
think that might be true. Anyway, let's keep going. I have a hard stop in 10 minutes, but this is the last slide, so that's interesting. You know, when I look at this,
probably not direct part of, but part of might be appropriate.
Just actually uses has member with networks right now.
Yeah. Oh, we do?
Yep.
I forgot if we use anything at all. Do we use has member?
Yeah, it's it's an artifact that has members, some network link or network node.
Yeah, that membership actually sort of does make sense. For a wireless network, certainly, because you kind of there's a temporality, but I suppose you could probably squint and say the same thing is true for a hardwired network.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Oh, that's good. Screwed up and got that one right. Let's move on. Spatial. At the moment, I think we have too many properties. If you go back to the first or second slide here, I'm going to go back real quick, maybe. We got all these. Geo directly contains, geo contains, geo directly contained in, geo contained in, geo occupies, geo permanent occupies, geo occupied by. I think the
occupied are different. They're okay, by the way. They're okay.
Yeah,
they're not.
I like those.
But they are definitely not necessarily part of relationships.
To the discussion.
I don't know. I remain to be convinced there. It seems a bit much to me, but anyhow, let's go on to digital for a moment. Maybe we shouldn't talk about documents. The paragraph is part of a document, or an article is part of a regulation, or a term as part of a contract. Maybe we should say something like includes or contains or something.
I strongly agree.
Cool. Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah, some of these are going to be thoughts for maybe next session or to take forward. But I also noted on events, the only thing we actually have is we have a subtask for, but tasks are not the whole of events. We've kind of subsetted it there, and maybe that wasn't quite right.
I think if we model processes, which are specifications of how to do something, characterize how to do something recipe, then each piece of the process, overall the execution of the process, say bake a cake, is the event, but it has parts, which was they'll stir the eggs in, put it in the oven, take it out, blah blah blah, and those are all sub events. But I've never needed to model those yet.
Right.
And Michael, you actually just said the word, when I'm looking at the chart here and I see events and I see subtask, those two words kind of jangle me a little bit. And what I think of is that if I'm looking at an event, events clearly have sub-events, or events can be part of larger events. But getting into task, whether a task is actually an event is a different question. And so
well, we have defined just task to be event, which is maybe not the best choice. Well, it doesn't correspond most naturally to regular everyday English, but I think event is, so just task is an event, unfortunately.
Well, I think and this isn't getting into the part whole thing, but I think to me an event there's some connection to time. And when I start talking about tasks, am I talking about the actual instantiation of a task, or am I talking about the specification of a task? Because if it's just simply the concept of tying my shoes, which I've done 1,000 different times, that's not an event. That's just a specification for it. And so again, I think when you talk about events, I think to me there's a very clear, there's a time involved with it.
That's true.
Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah, I agree with that totally.
Collections, I think we're pretty good with using just member for collections.
Yes, absolutely. It's just fun.
And we don't
remember
just direct member and a just transitive member. No, I mean that's kind of ridiculous. So
you could if you wanted to.
And then for concepts, let's not think of instances being part of the set of all employees or any. Let's just go RDF type classes and super property if we need to over there on the category side.
So I've got a couple of closing remarks, Dave.
Okay.
If you have so before we had this,
I'm going to hang up in about 3 minutes, so keep going.
Yeah, that's fine. I'll make it quick. So I think the next step will be, do we want to have more than one part of property? You kind of, so we've got several different characteristics of part of. In a way, it's faceted. Some part of has this, that, or the other facet.
Yeah.
So are there 2 or 3 or 5 different part of relationships that we can say, well, here's the top of the hierarchy, and there's 2 or 3 different sub-properties. I'm not sure whether we have that or not. We did do that originally, so I think that's one of our tasks, is to cover all these things by doing that, and it's useful to do so. I don't know the answer to that question.
Yep.
Well, it seemed at the very beginning. I mean, another piece is maybe continuing to look at the examples, and it came up halfway through. I can't remember the example. Oh, the network of membership version. I think earlier on we said membership is not, a use of has part. So are any of these examples actually better examples of membership?
Yeah.
I'm still concerned about this direct part of, because as Michael said, it depends on how granular you're being in your description. So is that really a balance?
I think it's good to have it available, but I also find that its utility is, you have to think carefully before you commit to using it.
Yeah.
Well, the issue comes down to, do you need a tree or not? Because if you're only using the transitive property, then you can never view the thing as a tree.
What? That doesn't make sense to me.
It doesn't make sense. It doesn't make sense.
That does not make sense. To me, if you just have a bunch of partOf relationships without a distinction of direct partOf, it can be a tree.
No.
Nothing to stop it.
partOf is transitive. Once you say that the carburetor is part of the spark plugs are part of the engine's part of the car, but it's all transitive. You say, what's in the car? Everything. It's a flat list. It's not a tree.
All right. I understand what you're saying.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, really, when you think of direct partOf, you got to think of, am I trying to represent a tree here that I want to preserve?
I hadn't thought of it that way. That's interesting.
Yeah.
Okay.
So I guess
Time's up.
Time's up.
Yeah, you see.
I agree.
Okay, that was great. Thank you, guys.
Don't forget to end the recording.